although I hear I've got a very loud presenter next to me, so I might have to talk very, very loud in this one. My name's Elaine Van Bergen. I'm from Melbourne in Australia. This session, normally I present in the technical track, but I've found some really interesting things have been happening when I'm talking to a lot of customers lately, and we start talking about, I want a SharePoint in the cloud, and they have no idea what the term cloud means and what the options are. Or also I've seen a lot of stuff happening where then they say to me, oh, I've heard you can't do blah, blah, blah in the cloud. Is that true? 99% of the time, it's complete made-up rubbish that they've been told by somebody who didn't want to move them to the cloud. So this session is not a technical deep dive. This is a business level session, and what we're just going to really talk through is a bunch of different topics. I'm going to go through some terminology around the cloud and some of the different words that we use for the rest of the session. I'll dive into some SharePoint examples, specifically if we're doing SharePoint in the cloud, what are the options? Then we'll dive into the pros and cons and why you might want to choose one above the other to suit your requirements. And we'll finish off with some myths. Now, I like my sessions to be interactive, so please ask questions as you go. If I say something crazy and you don't understand, stick your hand up, please ask, don't let me keep on talking. So let's begin with just talking cloud. What I find is technical people, when they start talking to business, I think they start to throw in a whole bunch of words just to try to sound very smart and trying to confuse people. These are some of the words that you might have heard. So you might have heard IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, Azure 365 hosting, a bunch of things. Who here has heard someone say on-premise today? Yep, the terms on-premises, really like my grammar here. That's quite interesting seeing a cloud expert say on-premise. Say, how well do you know the English language? Really, it should be on-premises, but typically, on-prem's used interchangeably now for it in the industry. The bits we'll talk through in detail, though, are these guys, SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. So these words are really different layers of cloud services that we go on through. And this is a non-SharePoint example. So when we talk about software as a service, this is really your typical example of email or CRM. You don't even think about where or how it's hosted. You just pay some money, connect on up, and away you go. Then we have the next level down, which is PaaS, Platform as a Service. Typically, this is where you get APIs, toolsets, services that you're actually connecting on into, but you have a little bit more control and you might be coding something against it. And then the lowest level down there is IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service. Easiest way to explain that is you're going to put up virtual machines. You're going to run Windows machines up in the cloud and have them hosted there for you. So that makes it a little bit easier. But what do you have to do if you have one of these services? So when you're on premises, you or your IT team has to manage everything. They're managing the networking layer right up to that application layer. Then as we move into each of those different levels of cloud services, you're going to get different options of things that are managed for you. So with your infrastructure as a service, typically somebody is managing, Microsoft, if we're going Azure, are going to manage the networking, storage, server layer, and virtualization. You don't have to worry about network cards or how your VMs are running. However, the pieces that they're not managing are how do you patch those servers? Are they running virus checking? What SharePoint configuration do you want on top of that layer? As we go up to platform as a service, then a little bit more is managed for you. So your runtime, your middleware, typically your OS is being patched. You don't even have to worry about those bits and pieces. They're looked after you, but you're still responsible for your data layer and your application configuration layer. Till we get up to software as a service, where the whole thing is managed for you and you really should just be, looking after the configuration pieces and using the software piece there. Now, who's heard the term cloud washing? Nobody? There's an interesting phenomenon going on in the industry, and you might hear this a little bit, where basically if you add the word cloud to anything, it sounds cool and you can sell it. Probably about 6 months to a year ago, it was governance. Before that, it was collaboration. We tacked onto everything for SharePoint. Just because someone says cloud, it doesn't mean that it's anything at all related to an actual cloud service. You'll see a lot of people now saying, oh, I've got my own private cloud. Well, a year ago, that was called the server room. Not sure how it changed across to a private cloud. It is actually possible to have your own private cloud, but what that would technically mean is typically you're going to have infrastructure where people can click buttons, just like in Azure, which I'll show you in a minute, and have VMs automatically provisioned for them, and it can scale up and down on demand. Typically, most of your private cloud, the server room examples, don't have that level of infrastructure on top, but it sounds a lot cooler if we call it a private cloud than a server room. So how does some of this lay out with SharePoint? This is really the best way I can explain each of the examples here. So when we look at software as a service, typically for SharePoint, you'd be thinking about going to Office 365. With Office 365, what we do there is you're going to pay per user per month to Microsoft. They look after the hardware, they look after the backup, they give you SharePoint sites, and we'll have a look at some a little bit later. And all you have to worry about is how do I want to configure that piece on top? Nothing else to do down there. The closest thing we have to SharePoint platform as a service really is hosting. The reason I call it platform as a service for SharePoint is typically if you go to Rackspace or one of the other hosting providers here now, they have SharePoint offerings. And they'll look after that patching layer and all those different pieces for you. So you just do a little bit of the configuration. Then if you actually go through to Azure, typically you're going to have to do a bunch of the patching and those things yourself. Now I've put a little star on the bottom there because obviously it depends on who you're buying it through. You can go to Azure and you can buy from vendors service agreements when they will take care of the patching, and that might move it up to platform as a service. Also, keep in mind, this is purely talking about SharePoint here. Services like Azure, they have a great platform as a service offering for .NET coding components and whole bunches of other pieces. This is just the SharePoint stack I'm talking through. So if we're going to look to move to one of these Office 365 or a hosted or an Azure model, what are some of the considerations we need to make sure that we think about before we move up? First one of these is how do I log in? You know, some people think that that's not necessarily a hugely important requirement, but for me, end user experience, if people don't log into a system, have a very smooth process, people simply aren't going to use it. You know those log-on boxes people get popping up all the time? You just want to shut your browser and not use it anymore. Now with each of these services, typically you have 3 different offerings. With something like Office 365 and Azure, also with hosted providers, you can actually store user accounts out in the cloud and have completely separate accounts to your on-premises login. This can be really good if you're doing something like an extranet. Maybe you need to have people that don't have current logins in your account, well, you'll often put the accounts up there and have them managed by that service for you. The next step up from that is to use something like directory sync. And we can actually use a tool called directory sync with password hashes, where it actually synchronizes up your account and a hash of your password up into cloud services. And then you come in and you authenticate off the cloud service. This is a really good option because it means that to log into these highly available systems, you're not dependent on any on-prem hardware being operational. However, the IT guys really get scared about this because they hear the password hash going up to the cloud and think that someone's going to be able to crack it. But it's actually not an encryptable hash that's up there, so it should be fairly safe to do that piece. The final way you can do it is looking at putting authentication software on premises that you connect on through with the cloud service. So this is typically where people will put ADFS hardware in or another single sign-on provider and hook it up to the cloud provider. Great option if you're using a lot of cloud services. It can be one of the easiest ways to go. However, I do suggest to people to make sure that that is as highly available as the cloud service you're connecting through to. I've seen a lot of great examples where people go to 365 and, you know, Office 365 is across 2 different continents and Microsoft has great uptime on these services, and then they deploy one ADFS server. If you can't log in as an end user, the service is not working. So you're going to need to do more than one ADFS server if that's the route you're going to go down to. You need to make sure you have proxies which are highly available so they can connect on through. If you can't host that highly available infrastructure, you're better off going that password hash route. The only con of the password hash is typically it's going to synchronize passwords up there at certain periods of time. By default, you usually set that to be an hour. So what that means is if you changed your password on-prem, and immediately tried to log into the cloud and that synchronization hasn't run, it's going to ask for your old password in that cloud service. The next most common question that comes up is, how do I connect on to internal systems? There's quite a lot of easy options you can use to connect on through to data these days. What you can do is you can publish out external endpoints. So this is very common if, for example, you might just have a web service or a data feed you want to connect to from Office 365 or something up in Azure. Typically, you'll just publish that particular one endpoint out, secure it away, and off you go. But some of the exciting choices that we have now with the way Azure and other hosting providers work is we can set up permanent network connections. So literally these hosting and Azure data services are part of your network. The services themselves are connected via VPN and various other options, and they really can't tell the difference between being inside and outside their network. There's a little bit of setup to get that done, but it's a once-off setup. Once it's set up and working, you can then connect on through. And that's really good if you're doing dev, test environments or production environments that need to talk through to a lot of your internal systems. With SharePoint, we then have specific examples where you might be running on multiple of these services and you want to connect them together. So there's a really common example where you might choose to put that extranet that I talked about earlier up in Office 365, but you've got an on-prem SharePoint environment. Maybe you've had some devs in and they've done a lot of code and you're not quite ready to move that up there. So you want to provide your internal users a hybrid experience across their on-prem environment and whichever cloud system you've decided to connect on through. There are easy ways to do that, and there can be very, very hard ways you can connect it together. Generally, the easiest way to do these things is where we start talking about a single direction hybrid. So for example, if you just want from your on-prem environment to be able to search 365, that's very, very easy because it's a one-direction connection. If you start trying to hybrid search together across the cloud servers and the internal service, this is the lovely diagram Microsoft gives you as to how the traffic goes when you do that. It's a little bit scary. I just like showing this diagram. There's a lot that can go wrong, and there's a lot of configuration to set it up. So it's not a don't do this, but if you are getting into these hybrid scenarios, there is a lot of good guidance Microsoft's starting to publish now. And in fact, just last night they put up a whole bunch of extra videos on the Garage series about hybrid connections and how to do these. But it's not simple. You don't want to go into this stuff lightly. If you can, you are far better off choosing to either leave things on-prem or moving wholly to the cloud and avoiding the hybrid scenario altogether. Let's just jump in and have a bit of a demo of some of the different bits and pieces, and I'll just flick my screen across so we can see everything. So we'll start off in Azure. And one of the interesting things that I just thought I'd show before we jump into the demo is a while ago, Microsoft didn't used to be considered a leader in this space at all. Those of you familiar with Gartner, they've got a magic quadrant for almost everything, these nice little diagrams that come up here. And the way these diagrams work is basically you want to be in this leaders quadrant up here. And this is the quadrant for cloud infrastructure as a service. So this is where Azure sits when we start putting virtual machines in there. And in the last year, Microsoft has gone from way down here with everybody else to jumping right up into the leader quadrant. And in fact, they're getting very, very close to Amazon Web Services. This article, and the link to this is actually in the slide deck notes if you want to have a look at it. It goes through the reasoning as to why each of these is placed there. But it's really exciting to see how fast and how much money Microsoft is pumping into this service. It's one of the interesting things with Azure. There's literally every week new features are turning on in this service. It's moving up there so rapidly that I'm pretty sure very soon it'll be up equal to this. So one of the important things to know about as well, if you are going to go Office 365, is things change a lot. This can be a really, really positive thing for users, but you need to tell them about it. Otherwise, they get very upset when things just suddenly turn on and they don't know what's going on. Most end users aren't that scared of this anymore. We've all got our phones and we see the icons coming in and everyone updates their apps really, really regularly. So as long as you have the right communication method and you tell people to expect new functions, and in fact give them an idea as what those new functions are, people tend to be really excited about it. One of the sources you can use to do that is this site here called the Office 365 Roadmap. It's quite new, and what it goes through is it goes through and talks through a lot of the updates that they're putting on there and what status they're in. So you can see launched, these are the ones that have recently gone through and changed, and there's quite a few things to do with Yammer, single sign-on, a bunch of other features. And then we have the sections here called rolling out. So these are the changes that you can expect to come online to your tenants quite soon if you're using the service. This is very important for developers to keep a good eye on this, because you'll often see things pop up here that may change your code and you might need to have a look at. One of the interesting things that they've put up recently is something called First Release for Office 365. And what this enables you to do is have an Office 365 tenant that gets the updates before normal production tenants. So what we're typically recommending for organisations is to have 2 tenants, have your test or dev tenant flick to first release, and you're going to see these changes go through, and then you can help with that communication method, you can test your code and actually know what's happening through there. And then the third section down there is in development. So these are a lot of the things that are coming in a longer term, and then they'll flick over to rolling out when they go into the first release tenants. You'll see down here, I keep looking on this and waiting to see when Oslo, Delve, which they showed in the keynote, I'm waiting to see when that one rolls out, because that's quite an exciting one coming soon. But there are just tons of these things that are rolling through, which is really good. So now we'll actually look at some SharePoint sites. This is a very boring SharePoint site, but it's just a SharePoint site. Oh, there we go, we've lost the internet, good. Let's log on there. That is, if we get back to it, a SharePoint site that is just running off my Azure tenant. Just, your basic SharePoint site. But one of the interesting things about it, I guess, is this is running over in the Southeast Asia data centres, which are in Singapore and Hong Kong. It's going to be a little bit slow, I guess, because I just lost my internet connection. But in general, I find that it's relatively snappy, even though there is quite a distance between those. For those of you that saw the keynote as well, you would have noticed that there was actually different data centres in there that have popped up. I think we've lost the internet connection a little bit there. We're going to have some data centres that are opening in Sydney and Melbourne very shortly, later in the year. And when you set up your machines, you can choose which data centre they go into. So I believe the latency for if you put the machines over in there would be a lot less than if you were going across to Singapore from here. Now, this is an example of what the Azure dashboard looks through. So the environment that you saw running there is a typical SharePoint environment in that it's running on 3 of my virtual machines here. So I've got an Office Web App Server, I've got a domain controller, and I've actually got my SharePoint environment running there. Nice and easy to set up. Some of the exciting stuff that I can do is just the speed I can go through and create new images. Typically when I deal with hosting providers, and there are some really good responsive hosting providers out there, but if I need a new environment, I've got to log a service request, and sometimes it takes a week. When I'm dealing with customers on-prem, I've got one where it takes 6 weeks to get a virtual machine. I can do this in about 6 minutes depending on my connectivity. And there are specific SharePoint environments that I can spark up here. So there's actually a SharePoint trial, and what that will do is it will create a virtual machine, put SharePoint on it. Note, this one doesn't configure SharePoint though, so there is still a bit of work to do if you go through and do it. In the notes, it will install SharePoint, but it doesn't put SQL or Active Directory in. So there's probably about 4 to 8 hours of work to actually get it up and running properly after you do it. But they have announced a new SharePoint environment that you can actually launch, and it will create an AD, it will create SQL for you and connect the 3 VMs together to get you up and running very, very quickly. Probably not what you want to do for a production environment, but for proof of concept, dev, test, something you want up and running really, really quickly, the speed of this is amazing. And then you can go on through. You can actually save a lot of these off as images. So if you are using an Azure a lot and you have preferred setups, your IT team will typically configure those off as you go. The other really exciting thing that I like about Azure is being able to see exactly what's going on and how these machines are running. Typically you don't get these kind of dashboards and this kind of monitoring, particularly not without, talking to the IT team and having to jump on servers and look at a whole bunch of things that are going. This is the SharePoint machine, and I sparked it up earlier today, and you can see exactly how much CPU it's using, how much disk it's using, how much network it's using, and how it's running across the day. I can switch that into 24-hour mode and see all kinds of monitoring across it as well. And we'll just get that loading in the background. I can go through and configure a whole bunch of pieces behind there as well. One of the other nice pieces is with the billing. Often quite difficult to work out how you're being charged for various bits and pieces for some of these services. But the actual traffic for the way these works is you go through, you click on your credit status, you see I've got a spending limit on mine. So basically I've got mine capped to use, I think, $150 or so per month. Once I hit that limit, it'll actually start turning off all my virtual machines unless I go in and authorise my credit card to put more data in there. And I can see exactly how that spending's going for the month and whether or not I've likely got enough credit if I keep using the service in the same way that I'm using it today. The really interesting thing that you'll see here is out of the $160, and I think I'm only, 26 days. So I'm only 4 days into my billing cycle. But right now, based on my usage, I'm averaging $1.51 per day. I have 2 SharePoint environments, 6 VMs. I'm hosting a website off here and a bunch of other things. That's not a lot of money per day for doing all those bits and pieces. The reason it's so cheap, though, is I actually shut these VMs down when I'm not using them. I typically use this for demos like this and demos throughout the day, and then I have them turned off during the night and turn them off all weekend. So a lot of my money is just purely spent on this piece down here, which is the storage. All the time they're turned off, the only thing I get charged for is storage. As soon as I spark them up, I start getting charged by compute. So this has some really interesting consequences where I have to look at how I'm going to use things differently if I'm going to jump into Azure. Click of a button. So in here, there is an option where I just go down and I can start. So that one's started up already. I can shut it down. I can remote desktop into every one of these machines and shut them down normally as well. Now this currently is reliant on somebody doing this. There are services out there, and actually Chris Johnson, who did the keynote, has a service called Curb where you can subscribe to it and it will shut down your VMs for you. Basically, it will send you messages. That's really good for those dev and test scenarios, because what we do find is devs, it'd be nice if they shut it down before they went home at the end of the day, but often they will just go home and might leave it running all weekend. If you actually shut them down, you think about 8 hours of a day they were working, more of that day they're actually not working than working. So shut them down, you're saving massive, massive costs on hosting this kind of information. Yep, that's fine. No, I mean, just like with any machine, if you had a whole bunch of things open and you hadn't hit save on those kind of things and you closed them out, there is a possibility to lose work. That's absolutely something that could be a problem. And there's certainly some applications as well that if you shut them down, they're going to take a while to start up. SharePoint's one of those. First time you boot up a SharePoint machine, we're all familiar with waiting for it to kind of spark back up. So you might want to put some special scripts on there to get it up and running and warmed up before people use it, for example. But in general, once you get into the practice of this, and it has taken me a little while to remember to hit the shutdown button after a demo, the cost savings are phenomenal. No, I mean, this is just a demo environment, so I literally just turn it off. It's probably not the best practice. If it was a production machine, you'd certainly want to gracefully shut it down, or you might not shut it down at all. But for a typical dev box, it's used to being turned off and on and recycled and all those kind of things. So it's really exciting, and we've got a lot of customers where they're now looking to move over, particularly for dev and test, if they're a little bit nervous about moving to the cloud, just because of the cost savings. We all know how much RAM SharePoint needs. It's massive, and typically we're always trying to ask as developers, can I have some more, because it's running really, 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 really slow. The things I can do here as well is I can just tweak the settings of these guys, and I can tweak them for certain periods of time. So, if we look at some of the settings of things that are shut down, I can, I've actually got these guys sitting on a redundant storage set. So basically, at the moment, they're sitting on geo-replicated storage, so a continent can go down and my VMs will still switch over to another data center and keep running. But I can also change the memory up and down. So you might have scenarios with a UAT box that you're going to run up here. 80% of the time you don't run UAT off it at all, or maybe you've only got 1 or 2 people testing. You switch it down to a really, really cheap amount of memory and a cores. Even if you leave it on, you're going to be charged peanuts per month. And then maybe you're doing a big upgrade and you want the entire business to test, but it's only going for a couple of days. Well, flick it up to a crazy amount of memory, 2 days, whatever, a week, 2 weeks, it's not going to cost you a lot of money at all. And you really don't get that flexibility on non-cloud services. SharePoint aside, we're seeing this used a lot for crunching big data sets now as well, really big high compute operations. Throw a whole bunch of stuff at a massive machine, have the machine up there for a couple of days, shut it down, throw it away, start again next month, those kind of things. So it's an exciting different scenario of how you might want to work. The other piece, which we had in the other browser, just with Office 365, you can have, there's a lot of myths out there, you can have a fully functional intranet up here. I've got lots of customers that are actually doing this. I've got a lot of customers that are doing document management on there, extranet, social, definitely the Yammer integration is a great way to go. Really, really lots of bits and pieces up there you can run now, which is nice and easy. Probably the only piece I don't recommend my customers running up here at the moment is websites. The website functionality is very, very basic on Office 365. So if you want a full content managed, typical SharePoint website, we typically put them on Azure or on-prem. But if you want your basic, brochureware website, that's okay on Office 365. With Office 365, you do get the same sort of level of tracking, and you'll often hear people go, oh, I didn't know Office 365 was going to go down, or it just broke on me, or it just changed. You actually do get quite a lot of notification and information. The problem is you actually have to check for that. They don't typically email you out unless it's a major big change they're going to make to the system. Then they'll absolutely send emails. But if it's just a minor change or a minor service interruption, this is where we have a look at that information in the service dashboard. So we can see here, for example, Exchange had a little bit of an issue. I can click in and actually see the full details of the issue and what they were doing about it. I can go on over and I can see even more information on that. I can see how it was tracking every day. Which one of these, that means it was being restored. There was a minor issue and exactly which feature it was for. Same with SharePoint. SharePoint's been running good for the last 7 days. I can also get this as an RSS feed, so you can use that as monitoring. I'd love this for an on-prem environment, just to see which feature has been running well. Has it been up? Is someone monitoring it? Very, very nice. And then I equally have the planned maintenance. Some of you who have an Office 365 tenant might have noticed my dashboard looks a bit different than your dashboard. This is because I'm on a first release tenant. You'll see these changes come through soon. Also, I do have a fair level of control over a bunch of the SharePoint pieces. So this is the kind of admin environment I get. Typically, a lot of what I can do in central admin on-prem, I can't do up here in 365. But I do have the important pieces. So these are some of the new enhancements. I can change the top bar up here, turning on and off OneDrive, Yammer, and the Sites tab. And then I can turn on Yammer or the SharePoint newsfeed, external sharing, set up various other features as well. And I can go through, create new site collections, configure search, info path, user profile, manage metadata, all the typical things that a business might need to configure before we jump into code. Quite like what we can do with site collections as well. You'll see here I get some information. So I can actually see storage quota for each site collection, what version it's running, how many resources it's using, and some basic statistics. Again, quite good for working out who's actually using the system, which one's actually using a lot of the storage, and I don't have to go to an admin service level report to do that. Creating new site collections, really easy. Create it through there, pick my template, and away I go. And what we're typically doing for a lot of our customers, though, is actually scripting that process. And we do that to make sure that if you're creating a lot of site collections, typically you'll want a specific template, various things enabled. There's some really great samples from Microsoft that run through the process of doing that piece. So that's some of the nice reporting for 365, and we might jump back to the slides.
So if you don't have Office 365,
Yep.
and you've just got SharePoint Online, you don't have any of that?
Oh no, you'll still have it. So if it's SharePoint Online, is just one feature of Office 365. So you'll still have the same dashboard. What you'll see is if you try to click on some of the bits that you don't have, like Exchange, so I have Exchange and Link on that tenant, you wouldn't see those options. It just say it's not configured. But yeah, all those reporting options and all those pieces are still there, and certainly Exchange is a really easy option to put up there as well. There's no silly questions.
Does the hash password work for Link on
Yep. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So the good thing about Office 365 is it's not just SharePoint. It's Exchange, it's Link, configure them all, and they all connect through to the same central services. Or you can pick and choose which different pieces you want. So I do have a lot of customers that do both SharePoint and Exchange. Less customers that do Link, because with Link there are some voice options and some different pieces which are a bit tricky to set up. But yeah, any of the authentication and all that stuff is common across all those platforms. With Yammer, which is part of Office 365 license-wise, there are extra steps for that single sign-on and for the directory profile stuff at the moment, but that will all be being merged. They've announced that it's on that roadmap that they're going to fix up that. It's just newly acquired by Microsoft, so they're still ironing out the kinks for that piece. So why would you want to choose these pieces, and what are some of the differences between all the different pieces? The most common reason for why you might want to choose one or the other is you're after a certain level of control. So depending on how nice your IT department are to you and what you can and can't do, in theory, on-prem, you're going to have more control. They're going to let you deploy code. They might even let you make unsupported SharePoint changes. They're really not going to block you from doing anything. Or for some organisations, it might be the opposite way around, where on-prem you actually can't do anything and they won't let you configure anything. As you move up to Azure, because with Azure you're running on virtual machines and you get the ability to remote into them and do a lot of that low-level config if you want to, you have quite a high level of control. What you can't do, though, is get down into that deep network layer and those bits and pieces. When we go up to a hosted service, they're going to extract that even further. So they're not going to let you patch things, or might not even let you remote onto the servers at all. Once you get up to 365, you have quite a low level of control. Even those changes, they will tell you when they're rolling out, but unless it's a very, very large change, you can't opt out. You're going to get that change rolled to your tenant, whether you want it or not. So you really can't pick and choose those bits and pieces. But it's a different cost model between all of those. So most people are quite willing to have the changes and have them come across. Then, of course, you've got level of administration required and how much for each of those. So typically Office 365 is your lowest level of administration required. There's no thinking about backups and all those bits and pieces. All you have to think about is configuration and what you're going to do there. As you go through hosting, they're going to take care of a patching and a little bit more. The same Azure, there's quite a lot you have to set up. As I mentioned, even to get your environment up there, you know, your IT team or someone is going to have to set up that Azure environment and connect all the VMs together and get it up and running. And then typically your highest level is on-prem, because you've also got to run your virtualization layer or your physical networking and all those bits and pieces down below. Of course, again, big star, depends on your support agreement. You can now go to a lot of organisations and they'll take care of the environment in Azure for you. They might even manage 365 for you as well. Any of those options change. So some of the different reasons people look at Azure versus on-prem. As I pointed out when I showed that payment dashboard, you don't pay for the servers when they're off. You're really just paying for the storage. Massive, massive chance to save money with those environments you don't need on. The scale is insane. I mean, you can literally flick it up. I think it was 56 gig of RAM I could set that to, and crazy amounts of memory. A lot of my on-prem customers, I'm actually having discussions with one now, and we've been discussing for weeks whether or not I can get 16 or 24 gig of RAM. And that's, you know, they'd love to give me the RAM that I'm asking for, but your typical SharePoint farm, in their case, it's 20 servers because they're a large environment. That's a lot of RAM they need to find in their virtualization rig to be able to give me the amount of RAM I need to run SharePoint properly. Microsoft takes care of all that in Azure, and it's basically unlimited scale as long as you're willing to pay for it. The rapid deployment, I can click buttons, get servers up there, no hold up there, and really, really quick. One of the big cons is it's reliant on your connection to Azure. This is through the internet. And you guys sometimes, particularly over here, I've noticed, end up with slow internet congestion going through the pipe. You know, you will have degraded performance if you have slow internet traffic. I also have one customer in Melbourne where their internet breaks every lunchtime because everyone jumps on and they all go to YouTube and all those kind of things, and they haven't upgraded their traffic. So obviously for them, Azure would be a terrible setup for you know, kind of business critical systems. Options for 365 versus on-prem. So different costing model, pay per user per month. That can be a pro and it can be a con as well. So, you know, if you're an organisation that rapidly acquire people and you're going to grow really large, you are actually going to have to pay for every single licence for people to be able to log into this system. Whereas with on-prem, there's typically a bit of flexibility there where you might true up every 3 years or every 1 year, and it's a little bit of a fuzzier licensing agreement. You can kind of talk to Microsoft and get different deals. You can actually put Office 365 in enterprise agreements now, which gives you that bit of flexibility. But there is no way to go onto 365 and have your account synchronized up without sort of paying for it, unless you look at the external user option. The external user option requires you to log in with a Microsoft account, so a Outlook.com account or something like that. It is the most up-to-date service, all the new stuff. Delve will go up there soon, as well as all the Yammer pieces. And as I mentioned before, it's not just SharePoint. You do get Exchange Link, Yammer. There's CRM, there's Project Server. It's just a matter of which licensing SKUs you want to add on to your piece. One of the, again, it's another, is it a pro or it's a con? You can't customize SharePoint server side. I argue that's a big pro because every time I'm taken into a SharePoint environment to fix a problem, it's bad code that someone's written. Office 365 prevents people from doing that. They can still write code, but it sits outside the system. And what that means is, the worst case, their code breaks, your whole intranet or whatever else you're running on SharePoint doesn't break. Their requirement matches. So the most common reasons I see people going to Office 365, definitely Yammer. Anyone that wants good Yammer connectivity, it's far easier in Office 365 than if you want to connect it in on-prem. There are some options to do that, but it's a lot more work to do. Delve, I'm very excited about Delve coming online. A lot of that's already almost ready to go live in 365. Microsoft hasn't announced a plan yet for how you would get that onto your on-prem environment. I'm sure they'll have some information on that, but it would be quite difficult to run on-prem. If you think about the amount of machine learning that has to do to be able to present all that information to you and really tailor it based on your user preferences, it's a lot of compute power that you'd have to run you'd run it on-prem. The external access, very, very easy to do an extranet. Equally, anything that you want to connect to from outside your organisation, Office 365, it's already on the internet.
Is there, if you've just got SharePoint Online, can you still do that external?
Yeah, absolutely. It's SharePoint Online, it's in 365, it's all over HTTPS, so secured by default. And you can connect on through without any issues. Even that Azure site, you probably notice there's a little red warning up there. So I've published my Azure site with a temporary certificate just to get it up and running. But it was just, again, just a couple of quick clicks to say, make this available via HTTPS, and I could connect on in. Whereas typically on-prem, I'd have to talk to the network guys and load certificates and do all kinds of things. So far easier for external access online. However, you do have to think about if the users don't have accounts, how you're going to authenticate them in and get them connected. Yeah, so I guess there is some features, and I can, while we've got the question on that, we'll see if I still have that dashboard up. So if we're talking explicitly about 365, which was the dashboard in here, so I do actually have a bunch of options if I'm doing that external sharing. So under settings, and we'll just get the other dashboard running as well. Under here, you'll see now this is new. So external sharing used to be in a bunch of different dashboards right across the place. But now I can turn on and turn off external sharing from a single place. So this allows me to enable access by people that don't have an account in my Office 365 environment or on-prem if I'm syncing that up. So you can see here, I'm allowing people to connect to my SharePoint sites externally. That doesn't mean they're available for anonymous access though. If I go over into sites, I then have a layer of control as to how I turn that on. So you could turn off external access and say nobody can connect on in. I've enabled mine. The extra layer of control, we can say allow external users to access your site with an account, so with an Outlook.com or another Microsoft account, or via anonymous guest links. This is Dropbox, basically. You know, if you've ever put content up somewhere, sent someone a little tiny URL with a GUID in it, they can connect on in as long as they know the URL without having to log in. Really, really nice feature, but you do have to turn it on through here. And then once I've turned it on, part of this new dashboard then tells me the sharing settings for each one of those sites. So once I've turned it on at this top level, I can then turn it on or off per site. And you can see here that my site piece, I allow people to share those external links. But on some of my other things, like a BI center where I've got a whole bunch of business reporting, no, we can't share information externally on that piece of my Office 365 tenant at all. So quite a lot of control there in turning those pieces on and off.
So if you wanted external users to use their Microsoft account,
Yep.
and can you specify which Microsoft accounts are allowed in?
Yeah, that's right. And you actually do have to specify which Microsoft accounts. So what will basically happen is when I go in, now that I've got those pieces enabled, and if we just try to share some content on my OneDrive, when I click the share option, it will ask me share with who, basically. And then I have the option of putting in accounts. Now, with the anonymous link, I can only do that at this kind of file level. I can't actually do it higher than that. That's interesting. There's share. So share, who do I want to share with? If I'm doing a Microsoft account, what I will do is I'll type in their Microsoft account. So I would actually have to know that in advance. That will then send them an invitation. They'll get an invitation email, click on that, and that will then grant them access to the site. If they never click OK on the invitation, it will not grant them access. So that's quite a nice security feature there, and you won't forget about them being granted access. And I can choose what level. So typically you have edit and view by default. If I was doing that anonymous sharing option, that's where I would go here and say get a link. And I can pick either a view link, which is the default link, or I can create an edit link. And then that gives me the URL, which I can just send on to anybody, and they'll be able to connect on through to that. If I just typed it up here, you'll see it's got a bunch of crazy characters on the end, so it's not something that somebody's going to fake. You're going to need to know that URL or have it sent to you by somebody to connect on in, and that will not ask for a login if you use that anonymous link piece. And then I can see who it's shared with. Absolutely. I did a section at TechEd Australia about basically data privacy. This can be an absolute nightmare if you turn it on everywhere. I absolutely wouldn't recommend external sharing right across the board. You really do want to use it in a controlled manner and where you need it, because otherwise you could have, folders shared willy-nilly with all kinds of different people. Yep. That's right. And it is a very common example. So I've actually shared my sites. You would have seen that pizza. I turned it on there. People get very nervous about that, but look, so many documents are getting emailed around and they're getting put on Dropbox and all those kind of things. If I turn this feature on here, I don't see that as an additional security breach, because you can, as an admin, see what's shared. You can go into that sharing center and you can see the files. You can't, so you have actually an extra level of control. Put it on Dropbox or send it around in an email. You might not know that file's gone out at all. So yeah, you do have a bit of reporting, but turning it on willy-nilly across the board, definitely a dangerous feature with the external. Yeah, only people that have permission to change permissions can share. It's not like a general user that has view-only permissions can go in and share that. But you do have to think about who you're giving that permission level control to. The old SharePoint days, you'd often give site owner or site administrator to a business user that's got no training and they're just meant to work out what to do. That is very dangerous if you turn on external sharing, because they might not know the impact of that. So we definitely recommend not giving out those high-level permissions to people that can change the sharing options to, widely in the organisation at all. A common example of this might be a tender thing, or you want to share some collaboration documents. Typically, you'll have them managed by very, very key people. You can go in here and you'll be able to see a bunch of whether they're shared. You can go into the site itself and see who it's shared with, but the reporting is not very granular on it. So yeah, you definitely have to be careful.
Did you say that external access consolidated dashboard, that's new, is that?
Yep.
That's not in the current
Well, it wasn't in my tenant until I turned the extra feature on to get on first release. Whether it's in your tenant as of this week will depend on where you are in the release cycle. So generally they say that what you get in first release is at least 2 weeks earlier than everyone else gets it. So I got that more than 2 weeks ago. It could be in your tenant, or you might be lower down the list. I do find they tend to put a bunch of the updates out in the US quicker and then roll around to the Southeast Asia data centres, so we're quite low on the list, but it shouldn't be months away. It should be coming quite soon. And obviously you can always take the risk and flick that first release button if you really want it now. Right, so yep, Azure, self-service, very flexible. Hosting's still a really good option if you're not sure what you want to do with one of these services, because it is a managed service and it is a very predictable cost. Now I showed the Azure dashboard where you get to know how much you're being charged, but there is a big con of that. If you leave a VM on, and I've seen devs do this, leave a VM on that's doing a whole bunch of computes, you can suddenly run up quite a bill. There is a limit on your bill, but it's a sudden bill and then it drops right off. Whereas with a typical hosting agreement, it's this month, this amount per month for the 24 months that you've got the contract or whatever that is. You're not going to go up or down. Then there's also hybrid. So most of my customers are not doing one of these things. In fact, I have a lot of customers that are doing all of these things. They've got pieces on Office 365. They've got other pieces on-prem because they're legacy with large customizations. And then they've got Azure for some of their more custom pieces that they wanted to spark up, or Azure for their dev and test environment. So you don't have to pick one. You can pick whichever one suits your requirement and even move between them as you need extra flexibility or you need different features. The thing to keep in mind though is setting these guys up is not too tricky, but getting large amounts of data into any of these services can be quite tricky. Office 365 is hosted online. You can't take a disk to a data center or anything like that. If you, like one of my customers wanted to do, want to put 6 terabytes of data up into there, you've absolutely got the space to do it, but it's not going to take a day. It's going to take you weeks to copy that data through, and there's special ways you can multi-thread it and get it up there a bit faster, but it is going to take a while. When the data centers come online locally, in theory with Azure, you can actually send a disk to the data center, have it attached, and if you've got terabytes or petabytes of data, that makes it a lot quicker to connect on through. Okay, finishing up with a couple of myths. Cloud means less administration. So I've had a lot of customers that go, I'm going to go Azure and I don't have to worry about things anymore. Well, when I set up my Azure VMs, it didn't load antivirus. It didn't do any backups. Yes, Microsoft has an SLA on that service in that they keep your SharePoint, your Azure VMs there and they back them up. But a lot of what we do is changing settings in SharePoint. If you tank your SharePoint environment by changing a whole bunch of things, they don't help you get that SharePoint environment back to a nice state. They help you if you corrupt the VM on disk or anything like that. So there is still a lot of administration you have to think about. Same in Office 365. Obviously security. We just talked about external sharing and how much work there can be in getting that right. Site creation, training, and deleting of archived content. All these need to be looked after, whichever environment you're on. Archiving is a big thing if you look at something like 365 or even with Azure. You're paying for storage. If you start leaving stuff there for 5 years and you don't need it, you are actually paying for that extra storage, whereas on-prem you might not be charged separately. So people get really nervous about, oh, it's hosted somewhere overseas, someone's going to get to my data, they're going to hack in. These links are through to the trust centers for each of those, and there's a lot of really detailed information you can give to your IT team, your legal team, your security team. It goes through exactly how secure these items are. Really interestingly, they're always worried about the hacker. They're never worried about me. I come into your SharePoint environment. Pretty much the first thing you do is you either show me all your passwords or you just give them to me. I've been domain administrator for a heap of customers. I didn't need that level of control. I've been SharePoint farm administrator for almost every customer. I actually get quite angry. I'm like, can you drop my security level down? Obviously I'm not going to hack into someone's environment, but if you think about the life of your SharePoint environment, how many different people you have coming in and out, helping with all your different systems, there's a fair lot of environments that are actually on-prem that are far less secure than what you're going to get up in Office 365 or Azure. Equally, Office 365, they just announced they're securing all data at rest now, so they're going to encrypt it on disk. I only have one customer in Australia that's ever taken that security step. Again, another example where it's more secure. There are definitely some people that do have some concerns. If you're defence protected level of security, you might not be able to use these services, but it is in the minority. A lot of it's about fear and worry about getting data up there. Another big myth, moving to the cloud is easy. There is a lot. We've seen all the different choices you can go through, and things changing really, really, really fast. So there's a lot you have to upskill with. It's not as simple as, I've got some IT guys, they know how to manage VMware or Hyper-V, they're going to instantly know how to manage Azure. Now, it's not something that's hugely difficult for them to jump across to, but it is new, and change is hard for people. Change is also hard for end users. So with Office 365, all those changes, they need to know about them. And we already talked about internet connection issues for getting data up there. Another big one you hear a lot, typically from devs, got to code everything differently for the cloud, which just depends on how it's written. A lot of the code samples that are coming out for Microsoft now tell you how to code things to work on-prem and in Office 365 and in Azure, and it's all the same code across all three of those environments. So if you're writing new code, it's completely possible to write the code properly now, and that's actually going to protect you as well from a lot of the deep and unsupported customizations that typically have plagued your SharePoint environment. Another one, no notification of change or outage. We saw the Office 365 roadmap, so that's telling you about the changes. It is quite new, but it's really good to know what's coming for each of those different features. And I showed you some of the dashboards you've got around how things are actually tracking. You can see over a week, a month, all your network traffic, all your costing and how it's broken down. So I'd argue that you actually get more notification than you do on-prem if your environment's up or down. And another one that I hear a lot is you can't brand or customize the cloud. There's absolutely no issues branding Office 365. That's just an example of a site we created for Department of Education in Victoria. What we've done with this one is site owners can actually go through, they can pick the theme and it flows through every single graphic in the site. So a really nice way that they can pick, orange as a background, all those icons change to orange and they can really feel like they own that section of, in this case, it's a school site. So what other myths? Does anyone have another myth they want to throw in there? Anything you've heard you can or can't do? Yep, so the one you can't put CAD drawings into SharePoint Online, I guess.
I think they were saying that data is not synced, so you don't put into drawing and into SharePoint.
Yeah, I mean, I found really that CAD doesn't play very well with SharePoint full stop, because generally your typical CAD drawing is a collection of files, and SharePoint's not really good at a collection of files. It only really knows about one file or another, and all the CAD software typically is not very good about connecting across. Specifically, there is a problem there with 365 because on-prem, it can use a protocol to connect to your on-prem environment that it can't connect through to 365. So that one is absolutely a true item, I reckon, there. And it's generally something that you will find a lot of the older software or more traditional software is going to have a problem connecting to Office 365. Luckily now, it's been around for a while, so lots of the vendors are getting up to speed, but it has been very slow, in my opinion, a lot of those guys getting on board. Any other myths, questions? Is that the search crawl is not very fresh? Yeah, so there is essentially the issue there with Office, and that would be specifically with Office 365 you'd be talking about. If you went to Azure, you would have full control over when those crawls worked, when you did continuous crawl. In Office 365, in that search dashboard, I can choose my managed properties, but I cannot choose when my crawl happens. The only SLA Microsoft gives on that is they typically say it's going to run within about 48 hours. And so you can find that if you're on a tenant that's degraded through various reasons, upgrades or things that are happening, it may take a while for that content to turn up in the index. If it's longer than about 24 to 48 hours, you log a service request and they will actually push it through and get it through in there. But that is definitely one of those ones where you don't have the level of control you'd have on-prem. So if search and search freshness is critical and you want to control it, Azure, far better option than 365. Oh, the old, yeah. So they can, look, to be honest, I don't know much about New Zealand and the legal system here. In Australia, we're subject to the Patriot Act. They can get to your data anyway. So, yeah, we're in, and, there is a lot of myths around that and lots of, it's quite interesting that I was at a customer and they're getting penetration testing done by an organisation. And they said, the PM said, I'll send you guys the spec for all our architecture and I'll email it to you. And the guy went white and said, no, you won't. You won't send it via email. He's like, but you've signed an NDA, that's fine. He's like, well, did the whole internet sign an NDA? Because your email doesn't go direct from point to point. It could go almost anywhere all over the world. And he was going to share, network diagrams and all kinds of things. So, yeah, it could be an interesting scenario, that one. Cool. One more question and then anyone? Any other questions? Azure or Azure? Depends if you're talking to Microsoft people or not. Yeah, I tend to say Azure, but Azure, just fine.
So can you decide what data center you want to use?
For Azure, yep. Yeah, absolutely. When you create VMs, you get that option, and you can shift them between data centers.
So depending on which legal, depending on what the legal standings are in that country, so in relation to your question, you could decide to host it in Ireland, maybe.
That's right. Yeah, you can see these are all in Southeast Asia, and I've got one in East Asia. I can't remember the difference between Southeast Asia and East Asia. But yeah, absolutely. You could choose Europe. It's just going to be a bit slower, potentially some of the connection. Yeah, you can have US, and you can have a mix. You can shift it all around. Well, when I'm on Azure, that is wherever my VM is stored. If I'm in Office 365, that's going to be in the Singapore or Hong Kong data centers. Well, I can see the next presenters in the back of the room, so I'm more than happy to answer questions. I'm just going to jump off the stage so he can get set up.